Not every shop stays open for the same reason. Some stay open for customers, some for habit, and some because certain conversations take longer than expected. At the end of a quiet street, there stood an old barber shop. The sign above the door read, "The Quiet Chair." And for nearly 40 years, men had entered that shop carrying things they could not quite name. The shop was not large. It never had to be. There was room for 2 chairs, a mirror, a few shelves, and whatever a man happened to bring with him, not in his hands, but in his thoughts. Dark leather chairs, worn smooth. They had carried teachers, carpenters, shopkeepers, fathers, sons, men who spoke too much, men who hardly spoke at all. And over the years, they had learned to wait. The barber's name was Oren. He was not known for giving advice. In fact, most people would struggle to remember anything he had ever said. Yet somehow, they kept returning year after year, sometimes for a haircut, and sometimes for reasons they did not fully understand. That autumn, a young apprentice worked beside him. His name was Tomas. Tomas had many questions, more questions than years, which was perhaps exactly how it should be. That afternoon, a familiar customer stepped through the door. He was a familiar face, the kind of man who no longer needed to explain how he wanted his haircut. He removed his coat, hung it by the door, and lowered himself into the chair. Oren wrapped the cloth around the man's shoulders, adjusted it carefully, lifted the comb, opened the scissors, and then he waited. He always waited, because after many years behind the chair, he had learned something strange. If you leave enough room for silence, people begin speaking all by themselves. And sure enough, after a few quiet minutes, the man began talking. Not because he had planned to, not because he had something important to say, at least not at first. He simply followed a thought, then another, and before long, he found himself speaking about a friend he had not seen in nearly 20 years. Tomas had heard parts of this story before, not once, several times. The names shifted, the details moved around, but somehow the story always found its way back. And that puzzled him, because Tomas believed that once a story was told, it should be finished. Yet that never seemed to happen. The man paused, looked at his reflection, and wondered aloud whether Orin ever became tired of hearing the same stories. Orin considered the question, not for long, just long enough. Then he made another careful cut, and another, and finally said that stories were rarely the things that repeated. The man asked what repeated instead, and Orin answered, the questions, nothing more, just that. The questions, and then he returned to the haircut, as though he had merely commented on the weather. A few minutes later, and disappeared into the fading afternoon. After the door closed, the room grew quiet again, and as Tomas looked at the chair, he realized that what puzzled him most was not the customer, nor the story, nor even the question. It was the way men kept returning to things they claimed they had already left behind. And the real conversation began. The door closed, the room settled, the chair sat quietly in the center of the shop, and for a few moments, nothing moved except the fire and the hands of the clock. Tomas continued sweeping, a few slow strokes, then a few more. He gathered the hair into a small, careful pile, but his thoughts were somewhere else. At last, he asked Oren why men kept returning to the same stories, the same memories, the same old wounds, the same places inside themselves. Oren did not answer immediately. He folded one towel, placed it neatly on the shelf, adjusted a comb, closed a drawer, then sat beside the stove, as if answers were not things to be picked up quickly. Over the years, he said, I noticed something strange. Most men believe they come here carrying thoughts, but they don't. They come carrying pieces, fragments, half-finished ideas, questions without shape, feelings without names. And while they speak, those pieces begin to gather together. A memory finds a word. A feeling finds a sentence. A silence finds a door. And slowly, what was scattered inside the mind begins to take shape in the room. Tomas Tomas listened. Oren watched the fire. Then he said something Tomas did not understand at first. People often think they know what they think, but that is rarely true, not completely. Most people discover their thoughts while speaking them. Oren had seen it hundreds of times. A man would sit in the chair, speak for 20 minutes, sometimes 30, telling a story he had told before, a story he believed he understood. Then, suddenly, in the middle of an ordinary sentence, he would stop. Just for a moment, as if he had heard something unexpected. Not from Oren, not from the mirror, not from the room, from himself. That was the moment Oren always waited for. Not the story, not the names, not the details. That moment, the moment a man heard his own thoughts clearly for the first time. Because that was usually the moment the real conversation began. Tomas wondered why it happened, why people needed to say things out loud, why a thought could live for years inside a person and still remain unclear until it was spoken. Oren looked toward the quiet chair, and after a while, he answered, because thoughts sound different inside the mind. Inside the mind, everything arrives at once. Memories, fears, regrets, questions, all speaking together. But when a man begins putting those thoughts into words, something changes. The mind slows down. One thought steps forward, then another, then another, and little by little, what felt impossible to understand begins revealing its shape. Not all at once, never all at once, but enough for the person speaking to hear where the thought is trying to go. Then Oren said something Tomas would remember for many years. Most men don't come here to be understood. They come here to hear themselves. And sometimes being heard by another person is the only way a man can finally hear himself. Tomas looked at the chair old leather chair, the chair that had carried thousands of conversations. And for the first time, he wondered how many discoveries had happened there. Not discoveries about the world, not discoveries about other people, but discoveries about the person doing the talking. Because sometimes the longest journey a thought ever makes is not across oceans, not across years, not even across memory. Sometimes the longest journey a thought ever makes is the short distance between the mind and the mouth. And that evening, as the shop grew still, Tomas understood why the chair was quiet. Not because nothing had been said there, but because so many things had finally been heard. Sleep softly tonight.